I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA. It's usually pronounced RFRA. But basically, this is a law passed a couple decades ago. Initially, it actually sounded good. Like, we want to protect religious freedom. And if you go down the Wikipedia rabbit hole for how RFRA was passed, I think during the Clinton era, it was basically to protect like Native Americans, I think, who wanted to use some drugs and some ritual, but they were getting fired because of it. And basically, the law says, look, if you're doing something for religious reasons, you shouldn't be punished for it. And basically, the law says the government cannot interfere with the practice of your faith unless there's a really good, compelling legal reason for them to do so. And that sounds kind of sensible, right? Like, I don't want the government interfering with what I find really important to me unless there's a really good reason for it. The problem is that in practice, RFRA has basically been weaponized by religious groups, almost always Christian Catholic groups, to allow them to ignore laws they don't like, because all they have to do is yell Jesus really loudly and they might be able to get away with anything. Among other things, RFRA has been used by pharmacists to avoid filling birth control prescriptions. It's been used by employers to fire workers in same sex relationships. It's been cited by parents who don't want to vaccinate their kids but send their kids to public schools. It's also been used by the people who run Hobby Lobby because they didn't want to provide contraception through their healthcare program for employees. So, anyway, so that's the basic federal RFRA law, but states can pass their own versions of it and they can make them a little more strict. And so earlier this year in Iowa, that's what they did. This is an article from April of this year. Iowa governor signs Religious Freedom Restoration Act, right? And you can see the subtitle there. More than half of U.S. states have passed RFRAs since the federal government passed its version of the law in 1993. So Iowa passed its version of this law. It's a Republican state by and large. And the reason I want to talk about that is because this week, a judge used that law to defend a pastor. And it's the first time the law has been used and cited by a judge to protect a pastor. And I want to talk about what that case is about because it's wild and you'll come away from it thinking, why the hell did this pastor get away with it? And here's the basic story. And this is such a wild thing. This is the headline, by the way. The only article I found on this thing so far: Iowa Religious Freedom Restoration Act used for the first time in court. Okay, so let's talk about what this story is all about. This couple that I'm going to show you right here, this is Brooke and Jeremy Higgins. And they are a couple that lives in Marion, Iowa. They run a church called Calvary Community Church. They moved there a few years ago to run that church. And here's what happened as for what they did. And I'm going to quote an actual lawsuit, a complaint rather. I don't think it was a formal lawsuit. But look at the right side here. I read through this so many times, this column on the right, because it's kind of convoluted. But my understanding of what this couple did is as follows. This couple purchased property in the town of Marion, Iowa. They then sold that property to the church that they run, Calvary Chapel, Iowa, for $1. You could see that right up there. Jeremy Higgins signed for both parties, himself and the corporation. The home was then constructed by the church for at least $765,000. So this guy buys the property for cheap, sells it to his church, and then the church builds a home like a McMansion on that property, right? The complaint actually said, we assume no sales tax was paid on construction costs. And then, right after they built the McMansion, the church then provided the Higgins with a mortgage, which was then forgiven by the church months later. So usually if you're buying a home, you would go through a bank and the bank has all this paperwork and the bank is saying, we own your house, but you can pay us back for it over the course of 20, 30 years with interest. And this couple said, why don't we just get a loan from our church, which is us? And the church built the property and sold it to the couple. So, like, the same dude signing the contract on both sides, basically. And the cool benefit of doing it this way is that the church can say the home is their property, which means the couple doesn't have to pay any property taxes on this McMansion, right? That's the disturbing part about this. And the argument that several Iowa residents made is that this couple is not living in some church-owned property that they are temporarily staying in. This is clearly a single-family home. You can't just slap a church's name on it and say, oh, it's owned by the church, no property taxes for us. It's so obviously a single-family home that they're building for themselves. And look at what they cited in support of this. There is an expensive privacy fence along with a hard basketball court in the backyard. They built a basketball court in the backyard. According to neighbors, rarely does anyone visit the home, and they have never seen any parties, events, or gatherings at the home. There's no signage indicating it's church property or a rectory. And yet, the property is fully tax exempt on the basis of a pastor's residence, aka parsonage. So basically, this is on the books as a church-owned property, even though the family is clearly not just using it. It's not like other pastors live here, right? Like, it might be legal in certain situations, this pastor's allowance, but this guy has no business writing this off in any sort of way. So this complaint says that under no circumstances should this home be tax exempt. The Higgins bought a home in this community, but they are not paying for local schools, roads, parks, emergency personnel. And why don't they have to pay for that stuff like their neighbors? Because they're pretending that this is church-owned property. And that's not all. The complaint actually had more proof that this is not a church-owned nonprofit facility, because check this out later in this complaint. Here we go. To support that even further, there are two registered, active, for-profit LLCs, businesses, operating from the home. One business, the Coffee Pusher LLC, is registered to Brooke Higgins, the wife of Jeremy Higgins, claiming the exemption. And the other, 6811 Productions LLC, is registered to their adult son, Devin Higgins, who also resides at this property. There are two actual money-making businesses operating out of the house. And again, that would be fine if this was just your house and you're using your house as the place of business. That's legal. But this is clearly just not church property here. You can't just set up your business shop inside a church and then like get away with it. You can do that at your home. So again, the point is, this is not their church property. This is their home. The county needs to treat it that way, right? So again, the bottom line, if this was a church-owned home, the tax exemption would be legal, but it's not. It's a single-family home. They don't deserve a tax exemption. So the question is, did this home deserve to be categorized as church-owned? Because all the evidence suggests it's just a regular-ass home owned by a family that also happens to run a church. Like, think about this for a second. If their church shut down or closed for any reason, and that happens to a lot of churches, do you think this family would be like, oh no, our church shut down, I guess we have to move out because the church owns this home? No, they're going to stay there because it's their house. Like, who cares about the church at that point? Everyone knows it's their house. It's not the church's house. And then the problem didn't end there, because it turns out the church also runs a preschool and daycare, and they say those are tax exempt because the church runs them. But according to the complaint, that's not what's going on at all. Look at this. Considering the daycare and preschool are not providing discounted or free childcare, we do not see where they are providing charitable objects to the community or to their religious society. However, they are tax exempt. and unlike other daycares in the area, do not have to pay taxes on their revenue. This revenue is then being used to finance the property at the home address, in which the director of the child care center resides with her family. It is a clear and obvious personal benefit for the director of the nonprofit daycare and preschool to be living in housing paid for by that daycare and preschool tax-free revenue. Iowa code does not allow tax exemptions on property for housing of non-religious staff. Like, she shouldn't be able to make use of a tax exemption because she's not a non-religious. I don't know. It's all messed up. You get the point here. I know it's getting convoluted, but that's the idea. So basically, this complaint was sent to the Iowa Department of Revenue. And they said, this isn't a lawsuit. They're just saying, you people need to investigate this. You need to investigate all the tax exemptions being provided to Calvary Chapel, Iowa, because who knows what we missed? Maybe there's tax exempt abuse or tax evasion that you have not uncovered or that we have not uncovered. So please investigate this. And the Iowa Department of Revenue took that complaint and they said, all right, fine. We're going to give this to an administrative panel of judges, which is the group that has to handle these issues, and they get to make the call on this. Okay. And this week, that administrative panel issued their decision. That's why I'm talking about this week. And so what did this administrative panel, this is a secular government-run panel of judges saying, okay, we see the complaint, we looked into this, and what did they do? They basically said, we're going to throw out this complaint entirely. Why are we throwing it out completely? Because Iowa has a brand new law called RFRA. In short, they did not have anything to say about the merits of the arguments that were made in the complaint. They said that random taxpayers, the 9 people who signed off on the complaint, the random taxpayers have no right to challenge a tax exemption that a church is already using because the Religious Freedom Restoration Act law in Iowa says you're not allowed to do that. All right. And here's what they said. I'm showing you what the judge panel wrote here. As discussed below, this is because this type of litigation imposes a substantial burden on the exercise of religion. Like, if we allowed anyone to sue religious leaders over alleged wrongdoing, it would get in the way of them telling their congregations how ethical they are. And if that sounds absurd to you, I think the judges even recognize that because they actually called on a higher court to steer them in a better direction. Okay. Let me see if I could pull this up here. Again, they said they're tossing out this case, but look at this line here. To hold otherwise would be to allow the unaccountable political opponents of a church the option to use the power of the state to target and or retaliate against the religious organization for the organization's activities, thereby creating a chilling effect, not only on that specific religious group, but also all other similarly oriented religious organizations. This is precisely the type of religious interference that RFRA was designed to prevent. And until the judiciary provides different guidance on the scope of RFRA, this case must be dismissed. Like, we can't do anything because the law tells us, RFRA tells us, random people can't get in the way of how people practice their faith. They said one other thing here that I found interesting. They said, okay, fine. If you want to file this complaint and you want to take away the tax exemption of the house and what the church has tax exemptions over, it would require the pastor, Jeremy Higgins, to provide us with a lot of paperwork, right? So we can make sure everything was done the way it was supposed to have been done and that there were no shenanigans in play. But here's what the judges wrote. Here we go. They're quoting from what the lawyers for Jeremy Higgins and Calvary Church said. And check this out. Here, subjecting Pastor Higgins, the church, its board members, its elders, and its members to defending against a contested proceeding, complete with abusive discovery demands substantially burdens religious free exercise of religion. It's so hard for them to have to pull up paperwork for you. Time is a limited resource. The work and ministries of the church will face the vagaries of litigation, which will take primacy. In other words, the pastor cannot focus on sermons because he would have to focus on the lawsuit, and that would be unfair to his practice of religion. Pastor Higgins will experience a chill on his First Amendment protected speech about socio-political theological issues and will face the choice of self-censorship or run the risk that petitioners will add more of his protected statements to their litany of complaints. They were not complaining about his statements. More on that in a bit. But basically, they're arguing that if they have to protect themselves and defend the shenanigans they pulled, it would take him away from preaching. And how dare you do anything that takes this guy away from preaching? Unbelievable. That is how good it is to be a Christian pastor. You can twist the law in your favor, arguably illegally, and then say no one has the right to challenge you because that would be religious persecution. So now, here's where we're at now. Those 9 people, citizens of Iowa, who put together this whole document and made the formal complaint to Iowa state officials. And now these judges said, no, those 9 randos cannot file this complaint. That means unless the Iowa Department of Revenue or some government agency initiates a lawsuit, there's no way for these tax exemptions to be challenged, much less revoked. And that's because due to RFRA, the state has to prove they have a compelling interest. They have to enforce the tax code, and it cannot be achieved in any other way but to make this guy defend himself. That's the burden they now need to reach, right? And there's no way to just let randos file lawsuits and give them the right to force churches into litigation. And so this lawsuit is over. This complaint is over, I should say. Now, will the 9 petitioners appeal? I don't think they will. It doesn't look like they're going to get a different ruling from other judges, so that's probably not likely. Which is to say, RFRA in Iowa is working exactly as intended. Because instead of promoting religious freedom, as they like to say it does, it's giving religious organizations another weapon to fight rules that are meant to apply to everybody. And that's really what RFRA is all about. So I spoke with a guy named Joe Stutler, who was one of the 9 people who filed this initial complaint. And what he told me is that this decision, it creates, quote, unfettered access by any religious institution to basically do whatever they want with no guidelines, no restrictions. And I happen to think he's right about that. And again, this is Iowa. It's a Republican state. So I doubt government officials are about to challenge a church for anything. They don't have the stomach for that. And certainly when statewide officials are all Republicans, there's no chance of that happening. One other thing about this bill. When I first saw this article on the local ABC News affiliate, this is the headline I showed you earlier. Iowa RFRA used for the first time in court. It was a weird article to read because look at this line. I had to archive this, but before school board elections last fall, Jeremy Higgins, the pastor of Calvary Community Church in Cedar Rapids, endorsed 2 candidates. As a result, a group of people challenged the church's property tax exemption before the Iowa Department of Revenue. First of all, if this guy endorsed candidates from the pulpit, the IRS should revoke his church's tax exempt status. He's violated the Johnson Amendment. I've talked about that many times before because he's not allowed to do that. But I just showed you what the complaint was all about the tax exemptions at his house. It had nothing to do with what he was preaching from the pulpit. No one cares about what this dude is preaching. They're mad because of the real estate shenanigans he was pulling. Like, I know that because I read the complaint. So where did this reporter get this idea that the complaint was filed because opponents of the church didn't like what the pastor was saying? And I think it's because the church's lawyers are like, oh, they're just coming after us because they hate Christians so much. And the reporter fell for it. And he wrote this thing. He never spoke to the people who filed the complaint. He just wrote up whatever the church wanted him to say. And I spoke with one of the other complainants who filed the complaint. And he said that after they contacted that reporter and they're like, what the hell are you writing about? None of that is why we filed this complaint. The reporter went back, corrected the entire article, and now it actually reads correctly. This is what it says now in this article. Last fall, a group of Marion residents filed a petition asking to review the property tax exemption on the home in which Pastor Jeremy Higgins of Calvary Community Church lives. Calvary officially owns the property for its pastor to live in, so it pays no property taxes on it. The Marion group argued Higgins actually owns the home. Property records show the pastor bought the lot in 2021, paid to build it. Dustin Brooks, one of the petitioners, said public documents show the church did not pay for the home. Yeah, that's accurate. That's the shenanigans that should be reported. It is now correct on the news website. But again, it's telling how the church is lying about what people are complaining about to try to get everyone off their back. So that pissed me off this week. What questions we got on this story? Crooked. Yep. I mean, it's totally shady. It is totally shady. I mean, I usually see stories of, or memes of pastors whose homes are tax exempt, because sometimes on Reddit or online, you will see pictures of like actual mansions owned by televangelists or Joel Osteen or whoever. And they're like, these guys pay no taxes on their home because their church owns the property. And it's the same type of shenanigan happening there that is happening here. But this one's even more blatant. Like, again, these guys built the home recently. It's not even like a huge mansion. It's a suburban home that is really nice. I'm not saying it's cheap by any means, but it's a McMansion. It's a suburban home. It's their home. They should be able to have the decency to say, yeah, we built it for ourselves and we will pay taxes and contribute to the community. Because the church isn't contributing to the community in that meaningful way. So patriotic and devout to dodge taxes. I bet you know how they vote. Because they're patriotic and like to bend the rules. Wait, what? That sounds like some kind of business accounting fraud, at least against generally accepted accounting practices. Sure seems like it. And now they're safe because they can yell Jesus, thanks to the Iowa RFRA law. It's very troubling. And again, there's no way against to fight this, because that's what those citizens tried to do. They tried to highlight the problem for the state. Why? So that the state could say, yeah, we're not allowing this. You got to pay property taxes. It would be good for the state. It would be good for the community. And these judges are like, yeah, we can't even ask them because we already said yes a while ago to giving them a tax exemption because they're a church. And so we can't now go back in and make them do the right thing. That's what the law prevents. It would be too hard for them to have to dig up paperwork. I feel like all these religious sects are pyramid schemes. Yeah, I'm going to butcher the statement, but what's the difference between like a cult and a religion? It's like there's always one dude at the top who benefits from it all, but in a cult, that dude is in a religion, that dude is dead. Yeah, I mean, again, even if you want to argue that most pastors are doing it for the right reason and they're not making a ton of money, which is true, it's really disturbing the way some pastors just rake in all this money and then exploit the law to benefit them even more. And they don't have to do it. They choose to do it because it's good for their pocketbooks, even though it hurts the community around them. So Iowa churches are now law-free zones. You can't arrest abusive pastors because they'd have to fill out paperwork. This is the question, right? Like, how far, what's the slippery slope of this law now? How much can churches get away with? Because again, if it's abuse, the state, in theory, could argue we have good reason to come after you because you are literally abusing members of the community. But I don't know why they can't make the same argument and say, you're cheating the community out of taxes that you owe us, so we're going to come after you as well. And if you need to take one day to pull out the papers from your closet Go do it. I know they are big closets in that giant $750,000 home of yours, but do it anyway. You could make that argument, but I don't know how far it goes. It's scary to think about. Every time I hear Hemant say Riffra, I channel Scooby Doo and say Riffra, Rutro. Well played. Well played. I should have thought of that first.